Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca La Fuente Wash Process Colombia from Koppi Coffee Roasters. There's the container right there. And Koppi, based out of Helsingborg, Sweden. And this is part 6 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series. And Koppi is a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel pretty regularly over the last couple of years. In fact, this coffee itself has made numerous appearances, having featured in last year's KaffeBox Advent Calendar. And we have also done a full bag review of this coffee as well. So it's safe to say we have a fair bit of familiarity with not only this roaster, but this specific coffee itself. So we will see how this year's version of this coffee turned out. And again, the way that this works is the notes and tasting wheel are made with the V60. This cup right here is made with the Chemex, and Koppi does have a loose brew guide on their website, which roughly translates to a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio. And we opted for just our standard 96 degrees Celsius, 205 degrees Fahrenheit. One thing that's kind of interesting is the roast profile, because this one feels the most developed of the coffees we've had to this point, and that's somewhat been in line with our experience with Koppi this year, as a lot of the Kenyans we've had have felt a little bit more developed than what we remember in the past. So this one just feels a slight bit more on the developed side than a lot of the other coffees we've had to this point. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. First impression through the V60, and what I really noticed was just how much it was emphasizing the chocolate aspects right at the forefront of the cup, as it was heavily textured, so a lot of body to it, really dominated by this smoky chocolate base. So the additional aspects I was able to get from the cup, especially through the V60, felt relatively tame compared to a somewhat dominant chocolate aspect to it, as there was a moderate citric brightness to the cup, as well as very faint traces of a slight red berry component to it, but it all remained encompassed by this very strong chocolate aspect. Here brewed through the Chemex, I feel like the cup in general is somewhat more tame but lighter, so as a result, the chocolate doesn't feel quite as heavy. I'm able to get maybe a little bit more of those faint berry aspects to this cup, but even then they're still so tame and moderate that I'm not able to pick out anything overly distinct or pronounced in addition to the chocolate, though the chocolate does feel slightly cleaner in this brew method. Other aspects I was able to pick up was this slightly herbal quality to the cup, with the earthiness of the chocolate remaining the most distinct factor, but the entirety of the cup, with the exception of the chocolate, remained pretty tame in general, nothing too strong or pronounced. Same thing with the Chemex right here, as it just really does seem to accentuate a more milk chocolate sort of component to it, but really kind of much more delicate, much more tame in general. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And I feel like a lot of the things discussed to this point will be demonstrated in this tasting wheel, so let's go through that real quick. We will start with the body level form. That's what I was mentioning, was that this coffee seems pretty heavily textured in general, so there's a fair bit of body to it. Through the Chemex, it actually takes a somewhat drastic change, because it's definitely not to that level 4 mark. It's actually on the lower side of level 3. I could justify level 2, so I feel like for whatever reason, the Chemex doesn't really give this coffee the texture and body it would have otherwise. Cleanliness, level 4. Honestly, it's on the lower side of that level 4. It's not necessarily the cleanest Colombian coffee I've had. Through the Chemex, it definitely does accentuate a lot of the clarity, especially in the chocolate, and it does clean up some of the more herbal components to this cup. So it justifies the level 4 through that brew method, but regardless, it feels like a level 4 to me. Finish, level 4. Again, we're kind of splitting differences on this, because the V60 did have a fair bit of that chocolate lasting finish to the cup. But here through the Chemex, it comes out kind of even, very like quick finish. So I would actually lower that down to a level 3 through the Chemex. But yeah, it has a lasting kind of chocolate herbal finish through the V60. Chocolate, level 4, that's the thing I've been discussing the most. That's by far the most pronounced characteristic through either brew method, just a slightly different chocolate, one that came out a little bit more heavy and robust, the other that came out a little bit more tame and delicate. Regardless, it's still a pretty distinct factor within the coffees, regardless of which brew method. Bunch of level 3s, so we will start with the smokiness, level 3. Again, it's such a huge change from the Chemex. This coffee is another one of those coffees that really seems to be very different based off of brew methods. I think this entire Advent Calendar series has been fun, drinking them one right after another, because I've really been able to tell how many differences I can pick up when drinking these coffees one after another. And this is another example of that, because it's not quite as smoky through the Chemex. It's not quite as bitter, because the chocolate doesn't feel as dark and heavy. and it's not quite as savory because it doesn't have as many of those herbal aspects through this brew method. That's why I'm really enjoying the Chemex for this coffee a lot more, but they were present through the V60 as the cup really had a lot of heaviness to it, not in the fermenty sense, but rather in just the richness of the chocolate to it. Acidity level 3, that one's kind of interesting. I was honestly expecting more acidity, and this is one of the weirder things I will say. I kind of miss the acidity. Having drank so many of these Nordic coffees in the last couple of days, I really was kind of missing the brightness that was coming from a lot of the other coffees. So this one, not having it wasn't quite as fun. I wish there was a little bit more of it. The berry fruit level 3, definitely on the lower side of level 3. I've had difficulty picking out some of the notes that Koppi has had on their coffees for a very long time. No matter how many of their coffees I've had, I've never been able to get the really strong flavor profiles from them. It's a little difficult to get them in a very defined sense, regardless of what adjustments I make, regardless of what brew method I use. There has been 1 or 2 exceptions, but for the most part, I couldn't necessarily see those red berries. Slightly more defined through the Chemex, but still very delicate and on the lower side of level 3. Also could be the priming effect in play. And then the citrus, which was the very slight brightness I was able to pick up from it. That's where the citrus goes, but there's not too much else in terms of those. I think the big thing we must discuss though is the sweetness, which is at a level 2. And that's obviously going to be a huge sticking point to me, as I really love my coffees to be as sweet as possible. But this one right here didn't necessarily have the sweetness I was looking for. Definitely the least sweet of the coffees we've had to this point, one of the less sweet coffees I've had in general this year or so. That part is going to be a little bit of a sticking point to me, but yeah, I think that this tasting wheel looks about right for what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Again, this one isn't necessarily going to be my favorite. I don't think it has been my favorite up to this point. Wasn't necessarily the biggest fan upon the full bag review. I don't think it necessarily placed overly well in the blind taste test, but a lot of the reason for that is it's not my type of coffee in general. While I do enjoy the washed coffees that have some maybe more delicate aspects to them, this one right here didn't necessarily have them in the abundance of sweetness I had. It didn't have the florality I was looking for. It didn't have the fruit aspects I was looking for. And while it did maintain a fair bit of clarity, it was also lacking in the sweetness. And that's going to be the biggest issue I'm going to have with this coffee, is I really wanted that to be ramped up significantly more. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to though, this one very much sticks in line with the traditional crowd pleaser coffee, because this one isn't offensive in any way. It's one of those coffees that really emphasizes the more chocolate aspects to it, has plenty of body, and I know that those are huge selling points to the more traditional coffee drinker. Even if this one, relative to a lot of the more traditional coffees, is still on the lighter side of those, it does offer a nice bit of the kind of, how would I say this, non-progressive ways of enjoying coffee. So not too much of the acidity, not too much of the fruity aspects, just really an old school cup of coffee in general. I think that's kind of the best way I can describe it, and I think that's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca La Fuente Wash Process Colombia from Koppi Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.